Hey guys, today I wanted to make a video about how I became fluent in Spanish and what I think you should do if you also want to become fluent in Spanish, or basically any other language. We're going to talk about Spanish today, but this will really apply to any language that you would want to learn. So, my progression into the Spanish language took place over about four main phases that I can pinpoint over the course of my life. Starting with school. So I started learning Spanish when I was in 8th grade, 14 years old, and I took Spanish classes all the way from 8th grade to my first year in college, which was, 6 years, or 5.5 years, because it was only my first semester of college. And, I learned a good deal. Classes are nice for learning languages. They're helpful for learning the rules, learning the grammar, becoming really proficient in the technical aspects. Okay, you do a lot of book learning. All right, and that's nice. The books can be very helpful. They can teach you a lot of the rules, but you just have to be careful, right? Because I think a lot of people think, at least I remember going into 8th grade thinking, if I take these Spanish classes, especially if I take Spanish classes for 6 years, I'm going to learn Spanish, right? I'm going to become fluent in Spanish. I'm going to know how to speak Spanish. And what I always say is that if you're learning a language from a book, that's kind of like if you want to learn how to swim and you learn a book about swimming technique, okay? Read a book written by Michael Phelps or by Michael Phelps' trainer. All right, you're going to learn a lot of information, a lot of useful information, very good information, especially if you want to get into competitive swimming. But you're not going to learn how to swim until you get in the water, okay? And if you think you're just going to read the book and then jump into the deep end, you're going to sink, okay? So I believe that classes are a great supplement to learning Spanish or to learning any language. But you have to remember that they're a supplement, okay? They're not the base of your learning. And unfortunately for me, it took me 6 years to realize that, okay? And, I was actually pretty motivated. I wasn't a super motivated student, but I was motivated in Spanish because it was just something that was a really interesting subject for me, probably my favorite subject in school. And I did try to, do things at home to try to learn Spanish. I remember being in 8th grade, after the first semester of Spanish, thinking, well, I've been learning Spanish for a whole semester, so now I should be able to watch the Spanish channel on TV and at least recognize some of it, you would think, right? And I remember sitting down watching Univision or Telemundo or I don't know, whatever Spanish channels we had back then. And I remember sitting down and watching a whole half-hour sitcom, and I was like, I understood hola, and I understood que hora es. And the rest of that went way over my head. So, if you're taking classes, and if you're expecting to learn languages in class, you're just going to be disappointed, okay? And I should also mention right now that if you want to become fluent in a foreign language, you're going to have to get used to the idea and be comfortable with the idea that we're playing for the long game here, right? You're not going to learn Spanish in a semester, even if you're doing everything right, okay? You can get pretty good in a semester, especially if you dedicate a lot of time and energy to it, and if you do things the right way. Okay, because you can dedicate a lot of time and energy to learning a language and fail to learn anything or not learn very much. So we're going to discuss a little bit more in that as this video goes on. So that was the first phase of my language learning. Sitting in class for 6 years, learning rules, trying to do a little bit at home, but didn't learn a whole lot. Okay, the next phase of my personal journey into learning Spanish is what I call the Interwar Years. Okay. After my first year in college, for 5 years, I didn't do anything. Okay. I was working full time. Um, I was traveling a lot for work. All over I was in the Marine Corps, so they took me all over the place. All right. I wasn't able to really take any classes. I thought about maybe doing Rosetta Stone because I wanted to keep maintaining my Spanish. Of course, this was at a time where I didn't really know the best practices for learning languages, so I didn't do much. One thing that I did do. Let me see. Do I have it here? I read. I did read the first two books, the first two Harry Potter books in Spanish. Okay, and granted, these books were probably even a little bit too far high above my level at the time, but I did manage to do it. A lot of vocabulary words that I didn't recognize. A lot of grammar was kind of going over my head. And, I think it was a helpful thing to do, probably. But I didn't learn a whole lot during these 5 years. The other thing I did that was when I first discovered Duolingo. Okay. Which, I had been thinking about doing Rosetta Stone, which is expensive, and I'm glad I didn't do that. I did Duolingo instead, which didn't help me a ton, but it was free, so didn't hurt anything. If anything, it may have helped me maintain or refresh my Spanish a little bit, clean some of the rust off, and it did help with that, kind of bring stuff back a little bit after, 5 years of not studying Spanish hardly at all. Okay, so that was nice. I'm glad I'm glad I did that instead of Rosetta Stone, because I wasn't making a ton of money, and it probably helped me just as much as Rosetta Stone. Looking back, I wish I would have known the right way to go about doing things. So that I could have actually been making use of those 5 years to make big leaps in my Spanish. But, Spanish was the first language I ever learned. So I didn't know the best practices for learning languages. I thought taking classes, reading books, and doing Rosetta Stone or Duolingo was going to cut it, and it doesn't. So that was the second kind of big chapter in my Spanish language acquisition journey. And then in 2014, I moved to Central America. And obviously, this was the period in my language learning journey that I saw the most growth. Okay. It made it easy for me to form relationships with people that speak Spanish and that I could have conversations with every day. But even living in the country didn't define my Spanish language acquisition. Okay. It was a big help. That's what I'll say. I'll say it was a big help. But there's this myth that I had always believed that the only way to really learn a language is by moving to the country. And this is wrong for two reasons, as far as I can tell. First reason is that I had a friend who moved with me to El Salvador at the same time. And he lived there with me for almost the whole time that I was in El Salvador. He lived there for like 11 months. And he didn't learn Spanish. He didn't. He wasn't motivated like I was. Until the very end. I think around we had been there like 9 or 10 months. And then he kind of realized, I just wasted this whole opportunity where I could have been learning a foreign language. And then so the last 2 months that we were there, he kind of started working on it a little bit. But by then it was just too late to really make a big impact. And he did learn a little bit in those 2 months. And he learned quite a bit in those 2 months. And he learned a little bit over the course of the other 8 to 10 months that we were there. He was able to understand fairly well. because he's constantly hearing Spanish all day long. You can't live in a foreign country where everyone's speaking Spanish and not be able to at least increase your understanding a little bit. His spoken Spanish was very bad. It was not good. He was able to sometimes understand what people were saying. Okay, so that right there just debunks the theory that moving to the foreign country is going to guarantee that you learn a language. He lived there for almost a year and didn't learn it. I also had a friend who moved to El Salvador, who was almost fluent in Spanish before coming. And it's just because she had taken classes in the United States and she had probably worked very diligently and she probably had just a better language learning routine than I had made for myself when I was learning Spanish in the States. And so she was almost fluent by the time she came to the country, which also debunks the theory that you need to move to the country in order to learn the language. All right. So no one will argue that that moving to the country is not beneficial. It is. Okay. For me, the biggest benefit of actually living in Central America was that it motivated me to learn Spanish. Okay. It didn't teach me Spanish. It caused me to want to learn it more. Okay. So I was seeking out more opportunities to learn it. And also it just makes finding opportunities easier because they're all around you. That's not to say that you can't find opportunities in your home country. Okay. And to be 100% honest, many of the things that helped me the most with learning Spanish while I was in Central America are actually things that you can come into contact with in your home country. Okay, for example, I made little flashcards for myself. All right, these are actually flashcards that I made for myself for learning Greek, but I did the same thing with Spanish when I lived in El Salvador, and I just made a ton of these. Okay, I carried them around with me everywhere I went. I had a little bag that I carried flashcards in, and every time I had a few minutes, if I had a meeting that I was waiting for, if I, was on the bus, I'd bust out my flashcards and I'd start learning vocabulary. And I went through a ton of index cards. That's all these are. They're just little index cards that I cut in half. I wrote a definition on one side, and I guess this is an incomplete card, but I would write a definition on one side and the translation on the other. And I was constantly making myself new index cards. And what I did is, let's see, do I have it around here? I don't know where I have it, but I had a little pocket-sized notebook that I took with me everywhere I went. And if I was on the bus, if I saw a word, or if I heard someone say a word, or if anytime I recognized a word that I didn't know, or if I wanted to use a word in Spanish that I didn't know how to say in Spanish, I would then look it up in my little dictionary that I also carried with me. I was a very low-tech person. Physical flashcards, physical notebooks, physical dictionaries. Anyways, if I wanted to look up a word that I didn't know, then I would write these words down in my little notebook. And I had a goal of writing 10 words in my notebook every day. And then when I would get home from work or from wherever I was going that day, I would get home and I would write down the 10 words in my notebook onto little flashcards. So that way I had the system where I was generating at least 10 new flashcards every day. And it was very beneficial for me in learning a lot of vocabulary very quickly. And the amazing thing, especially when you live in the country, when you learn one new vocabulary word, you instantly start to see that word everywhere. It's just like, it just comes to you like a magnet. And you're like, how did I live my whole life in El Salvador so far without ever having noticed this word before? And now all of a sudden it's everywhere. But it just happens. It's just this crazy thing about learning vocabulary. So I made myself physical flashcards, and I was just obsessive about learning vocabulary. I also continued using Duolingo, which I had already been doing before, and I started using Memrise. Okay, so maybe a little bit redundant using physical flashcards and start using Memrise, but It worked out. It was helpful. It was beneficial. Memorize gave me little reminders every day to remind me to keep working on vocabulary. And I was just searching out any way I could to learn Spanish. When I moved to El Salvador, I just became obsessed with language learning. I continued reading books in Spanish. Let's see. Oops. I'm knocking all my books over. I started reading Maze Runner en Español. And I didn't know, my Spanish still wasn't great at that time. Let me see. This is the second book. The first Maze Runner book, I read through the whole thing and I highlighted like every word that I didn't know. And then I would go through again and write little definitions next to the words that I didn't know, little translations. And that was helpful. There's some debate about whether should you worry about understanding every single word or should you just read for pleasure and not worry about the specific details and just get the general understanding of the book. I did more of the former, okay, and it helped. Okay, that's all I'm going to say. It helped. There probably is a good argument to be made for not worrying about learning every single little detail and making sure you understand 100%. Okay, you don't need to do that. But I did, and I still learned, okay? So maybe learn from my mistakes. Don't do unnecessary work, okay? I'm just saying that there is a good reason to. It sounds like you're being lazy. Let me put it this way. It sounds like you're being lazy when you don't want to look up all the words, okay? But there's not. There's actually scientific reasons. There's second language acquisition experts that say when you're reading, just make it through the book. Just get a lot of input and don't worry about understanding everything. Read for the general understanding, the general concepts. Okay. And maybe one of the biggest things that I did in El Salvador that set me apart from my one friend who didn't learn Spanish is that I always tried to avoid English speakers. Okay. A lot of you probably know moving to a foreign country, especially if you're a native English speaker, moving to a foreign country, it's so easy to hang out with people that just speak English. Okay. Because everyone's learning it in high school. You can find people that have learned English to a very good degree, even if they never left their home country. You can also find expats who are there working. They're very easy to make friends with because you're both in this foreign country together, going through culture shock together. It doesn't take any work to communicate with them. It's just easy, all right? And it just seems more natural. There's no cultural barrier between you, and it's easy to hang out with them. I avoided this, okay? And I had a friend in El Salvador who was an American. She was an expat with me. We were there working together. And she actually told me towards near the time that I was about to leave El Salvador, she told me, when you first came here, you kind of felt me bad, which is, it's a really funny way of saying, that's so funny. So in Spanish, what you would say, you follow me bad. It means like you kind of rubbed me the wrong way. It's maybe not as harsh as saying I don't like you, okay? But I don't know how to explain that. You follow me bad, and that's what she said. She said when you first came here, you kind of felt me bad. You rubbed me the wrong way because I would avoid all the other Americans. Okay, if I met an American, I would try not to sit by them. Okay, I don't want to sit by Americans. I don't want to speak English with you. I want to find someone who speaks no English. If you're a native Salvadoran and you failed your English class in high school, I want to sit by you because I want to learn Spanish. Okay, and it's hard. It's a lot more work. It's very difficult. And I probably can't communicate everything that I want to communicate to you. But I would rather sit with you than with my American friend who is just easier to hang out with. And she was like, yeah, I couldn't believe that you would just try to avoid us all the time. Like, we Americans should stick together. And, I guess I kind of annoyed her, but I don't care. I don't give a crap what she thinks. I was there to learn Spanish, and I didn't want to sit with her. I wanted to sit with people that spoke Spanish, and, it was a good thing to do, because I was constantly trying to have little conversations. At first, I couldn't. It was very hard. You're always searching for the word. You're always searching for some way to say what you want to say without the words, without the grammar. You got to talk around it. You got to learn how to do circumlocution. And they would help me. Gosh, they would bend over backwards to help me learn Spanish. Even if they knew no English, they would help me in Spanish. And I would always be searching for the word. And if they don't speak English, then I can't just say, como se dice helicopter, right? I would have to try to act out a helicopter or do some kind of sign language motions to get them to understand. And then they would say, oh, okay, now I know what you're talking about. And, they would tell me the words. And man, they were helpful. My friends were very helpful for me learning Spanish. So I would say that living in El Salvador was definitely the period where I grew the most in learning Spanish. Then after that, I moved into the fourth period of my Spanish language acquisition, which I guess I'm in right now. And that's moving back to the United States and continuing to learn as much as possible. So I will say that I've been back from El Salvador for now almost 3 years. Because I moved back in the beginning of 2016. And I'm not as fluent in Spanish as I was back then. I have lost some of my ability to communicate quickly and fluently and with ease. I would say I've probably increased some of my knowledge and my understanding of some of the rules and the grammar and some of the finer points of the Spanish language. But it doesn't roll off the tongue as quickly as it used to. Okay? But that's okay. I think that's probably kind of natural because I'm not surrounded by Spanish as much as I have been, as much as I was back then. I'm learning French now, which has been kind of a damper on my Spanish language maintenance. Okay? Because every time I try to speak Spanish, inevitably some French word is just going to come out. Either that or I'm going to catch it beforehand and I'm going to think, okay, it's not maintenant. How do you say maintenant in Spanish? It's yo quiero hacer eso ahora. And then it kind of comes, right? So Spanish doesn't roll off the tongue as easily for me as it did back then. But it's still in there. Okay, because I'm spending so much time learning French and actively learning French, that's what comes out a little bit more naturally for me right now. But I do find that whenever I go back to a Spanish-speaking country, I spent a month and a half in Spain this summer, and it comes back. Man, you just spend a few days, maybe a week, really in conversation, and you realize that it's not gone forever. And I'm sure if I go back I'm planning on taking another Spanish class next semester. It'll be my last semester in college, and I'm going to take another Spanish class, and I know it's just going to come back. It's like learning to ride a bike, maybe. I don't know, I guess maybe that metaphor is a little bit overused, but if you don't do it for years, then, or maybe like playing the guitar. I've gone through some periods where I just don't play the guitar very much, okay? And then I pick it back up, and I still remember how to do it, okay? I might not be as fast. I might not remember exactly how to do some of the songs, but then I play around with it a little bit, sit there tinkering around. I figure it out. And, and then that feeling comes back, that muscle memory comes back, and it still comes back, okay? So what I have been doing since I moved back to the United States, I did take a few Spanish classes, and I think that was helpful for maintaining. I've been listening to music, okay, and I do this a lot. And like I've said before, I think music is one of the easiest things that you can do to maintain languages. It's also one of the most useful because you just start to get these phrases lodged in your head. and you have, every time you learn a new phrase, it's like filling up your ammo belt, okay? Learning a new phrase that comes from a song is just another thing that you can say. You know exactly how to say it because you heard a native speaker or a native singer say it in a song. Okay, so when it comes to real conversations, you just know how to say it. I've been reading a few books. I have mainly been reading French books since I've been back, but I've read maybe 3 or 4 books in Spanish since I've been back, and I still find people to speak with. Okay, they're not everywhere like when I lived in El Salvador, but you can find them. All right. So that's the 4 main phases of my life that helped me learn Spanish. Okay, I will say that there's no one key to learning a foreign language. Okay, the key, as far as I'm aware, that helped me learn Spanish was just becoming obsessed with it. Trying to do something every day, as much as I can, from the time I wake up to the time I go to bed, immersing myself in Spanish. And you can immerse yourself in Spanish just as much in the United States as you can in El Salvador. Okay, or in any other country that you would want to learn Spanish in. Try to find people. If you can find people to speak with, that's going to give you some more motivation. It's going to make learning a whole lot easier and a whole lot more fun. Okay. When I lived in El Salvador, my roommates, most of them spoke Spanish. When we would go to a movie was in Spanish, right? When I would have meetings were in Spanish. And then when I would sit on the bus and have a conversation with my friends, conversation was in Spanish. Okay, people make it easier to be motivated to learn your language. So that's where I'm going to end it today. I know I've been kind of rambling on. This video went longer than I thought. If you're new to my channel, thanks for watching. Please feel free to subscribe if you're interested in language learning in general or in Spanish. I release new videos every Monday and every Friday, so you'll be getting a lot more content where this came from. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in my next video.